Thank you for joining. I wanted to thank those of you who continue to work on the front line. We're thinking of you and are very grateful. And for those that have lost friends and family or are dealing with illness or other effects of the crisis, we are really thinking of you. If there's somebody out there who needs help, please reach out. Though the pandemic has hit us all in many different ways, one thing we all have in common is that our lives have been profoundly different, and there's unprecedented uncertainty. The opening up of lockdown across the United States and all the countries of Europe have prompted this week's topic of what next. The bulk of the discussions, comments, and questions that I've had recently, both professionally and just with my family and with people I'm talking to, have been around this issue. And more specifically, I think some of the points have been around disagreements that have already arisen or that people fear will arise around how to begin to open up our lives after this long period of lockdown, either within their family or within their household for people who are sharing houses with people that are not family, or at work, either going back to work or continuing the working from home with occasional return to work. So that's going to be the topic for today. I'm going to share my screen with you so that you can see the slides of the presentation. First, I just want to look at where we are, which is our status quo. It's pretty much the same for most people. We've been spending 3 months of managing risk, gaining information, processing it in different ways for each of us. And I think some households have got a pretty good agreement going on and everybody's around the same. I've certainly heard of plenty of households that are not so fully in agreement, and there's a truce. They found a way to muddle along one way or another. And I think for many households, whether you lean more to agreement or more towards truce, there's been a compromise of some kind. But I think there are very different approaches to this, and I think that we've responded to it in very different ways. And I think there are some people for whom actually this period has been very comfortable. And what's going to be hard for them is to recognize that this was only ever an interim status. There's, for many people, there's a sense that this is something that calming down and slowing down of life is very popular for them and something that they feel much more comfortable with. Whereas there are others, of course, who are much more uncomfortable with the situation, that it's been a difficult way of coming to an agreement within a household. And compromise is very tiring. It's exhausting. And I think many people throughout the last weeks and months have talked about how surprised that they are as tired as they are. The final thing is that really always transitions are hard. So we've had a transition into this period of our last 3 months of status quo, and we've got a big transition that's going to be coming out on the other end. Today's discussion, I'm afraid, is not intended to solve anybody's disagreements by pointing to a kind of right answer. It's intended instead to help you navigate the conversations around these necessary discussions by highlighting some of the issues that we should all be considering when having these conversations. We will also examine some of the tried and tested methods of coming to successful agreements around tricky subject matter. Many of these are common sense, but you'd be surprised how many we ignore or skip in the anxiety of having these difficult conversations. So I think what I want to get you to begin with is just to think about how you're going to navigate the next steps and some of the things that I want you to keep in mind as you are both thinking about it for yourself, thinking about how you're going to engage your family, your partner, the people that you're living with in this discussion. So if you are more than a household of one, there are many differences. There is a multiplicity of both inherent differences through the wiring that we were born with and acquired differences through our experiences in life and the situation that we're in right now. If you're alone, on the other hand, you will be able to make all these decisions by yourself. But now as we open up, you're going to encounter many more people in the outside world with their multiplicity of different situations and opinions and characteristics. So let's just look at what some of those are. We've got the very natural split between people who are more introverted and therefore have been much more settled in this closed down period, and those who are extroverted or more extroverted, who have been really missing the social aspect of what was part of their lives before. you've got different levels and layers of vulnerability, both in people's health and also, financially, what people can tolerate in way of risk. There's generational differences. People are going to think about things differently as if they're older than if they're teens. If you've got both sides in the family, you've got both of the top and tail of the older generation and the younger, there's going to be naturally a different viewpoint on what they're going to be wanting to do, and essentially what risk they can tolerate. And I think that we're wired with different risk tolerance levels, but also I think that the situation that we're in really throws that up and throws that into relief. Financial needs are different. Some people are going to feel imperative that they go out into the world and that they can start to regain an income that they may have lost. For other people, they can work from home effectively. And this is not a sort of a final description. There are many, many others that we haven't touched on, but another that I've heard a lot of differences is people who are very focused on their family and very focused on their household, and others who tend to be much more open or much more focused on what is a more common good or a more societal good. So you're going to have a lot of differences in that too. Opinions are going to differ whether you're talking about safety and changes within home, the way you shop, the way you see people socially, and things that will change within work. So bear in mind those may be two different conversations. And finally, just remember that stress exacerbates prior characteristics. I think we've talked a lot, and there's been a lot in the papers around how stress makes serious physical illness and mental distress so much worse. But I think it's worth remembering that it's also just true of many of our basic characteristics, both large and small. If you're a person that is more likely to be quite black and white in your thinking, that's going to be exacerbated during this period. If you're somebody who makes it really hard to make decisions, you tend to be indecisive, that again is going to be much more underlined, and you're going to find that's much more of an issue for you. So just bear that in mind, both for yourself and for others. So one of the things that I would recommend, given all these differences and all these different issues that there are to talk about, is that you invest real time and effort in what I call talking about talking. And talking about talking is really the preparation of how you're going to have this discussion. So you don't just plunge straight in and say, okay, we've got a decision to make, and we've got 5 o'clock this afternoon, we have to decide whether we're doing X or Y. I want you, as much as possible, if it is at all possible, to really put in the prep ahead of time. So go back to basics. We often make assumptions about each other, and we often think that others are psychic or must know what we believe. Instead, make these things spoken rather than assumed. So first is discuss assumptions. The assumptions should be really getting a chance to talk about your beliefs, your values, and your priorities. You may be surprised how people will value different aspects of their safety or different aspects of the family situation more than others. And I think it behooves us to get that out and in the open as much as possible ahead of time. And then you will be able to fold that into the discussion as you're having it. And it doesn't then come up as a sort of surprise halfway through a discussion that actually you started with very different basic assumptions. The same is with expectations. This is about level of safety. This is about, are you just looking for a sensible policy? What is the underlying need for the discussion that you're having and what you need to work out in the family? And that leads into the discussion of goals. Are you making a plan for a week? Are you making a plan for a month? For the rest of the year? Is it for just 2 of you? Is it for a whole family? You've got to start to think about what is the purpose of the discussion and what you're trying to get out of that. As you're doing this, think back to that previous slide of all the very deep differences that we have as individuals, and be aware that you're going to be looking at each of these things through very different lenses. So try and sort of step slowly and relatively carefully around this so that you can air these without shutting down other people's viewpoints or opinions. So the pro tip, I think, in these discussions is that there is no such thing as zero risk. There never was in our day-to-day lives before this pandemic, and there isn't now. And so what I want you to try and focus on is that the aim is a compromise. It still has to be what is acceptable to you. It's about managing acceptable risk, and your household may be entirely different from mine or anybody else's. It's not about a compromise that is just, you know, what is suitable for one person, not the other. It's somewhere finding that middle ground for you. So again, we're talking about preparation for this. So I wanted to talk about very practical preparations. The previous slide was about the things that you want to be discussing around this ahead of the conversation. And this is more about the practicalities. Plan ahead, state your objectives, avoid surprises. Don't spring a meeting on somebody that may just flare up their anxieties on that. Don't make it on a deadline. If you can possibly do it, don't do it the morning before you have to make some big decision about whether you or someone in the family is going to go out and engage in some social activity or work activity. If you have the time pressure, you're automatically increasing the stress that everybody's bringing to the meeting. Have a time limit. I know this sounds the opposite of the earlier one, but have a time limit for the conversation. I think conversations, when they're endless, tend to veer towards disagreement rather than towards agreement. So have a limited amount of time, and then when it seems that you're getting to that time, if you're in a good place, stop, underline what you've agreed, and then agree to pick up at another time. If you find that you're in a stuck place, then underline where you've got stuck and say that's where you're going to pick up at the next time. And I would say it's very important to try and invite participation, even if it's a family where you're talking about kids who you might just say, well, this is something we need to do. Giving them a sense that they are invited in, that you're not just demanding everybody's presence, that it's something that's necessary to do as a family. It's something that you underline as a kind of key importance for everybody who's going to be turning up. And remember that conversations are layered. If you end this one, your first one, positively, just reschedule the next one and you will build upon the positivity of the previous conversations. If you had a rough time in the first conversation, you can still end on a positive note where you're saying, I've noticed that these are our differences and this is what we're going to go towards next time. You're not shutting anybody down and you're not just moving away from a situation by saying, oh, this is too difficult, we can't speak to it. It's like, we'll come back and talk about it in a different way. So let's then talk about some conversation guidelines. Again, this is sort of the prep ahead. You might want to come up with your own within the family. You might want to just say, this is what you've thought of as being suitable. It's some basic things, but it's amazing how in very complicated conversations and conversations where a lot is at stake, it's very often that we can forget these things. The language you use, the tone you use, and the body language. I think that one should be able to call people out and ask them to restate things if it feels like it was sarcastic, if it feels like it was rude, or there's eye rolling so it feels that people are being shut down. As much as possible, use I statements. Ask everybody in the group, in the conversation, in the meeting, to talk about how they feel, not how it is. They're not making a statement that that is the law of the land or the way it is and everybody else has to agree. It's about coming from a place of what you're feeling and what you're experiencing yourself. So then listen. We talked about this before in previous webinar. Listening involves trying to understand. So that will include being curious. If somebody has a position that you just don't get, you're just so different from what you're thinking, don't just say it's different from what you're thinking. Ask them to explain it to you. Ask them for clarification. You might, in that discussion, understand more of what it is that they're wanting. And you might find that is easier to get towards a compromise if you understand that. And remember that being heard has a value per se. In and of itself, I think that it's easier, again, to come to a compromise if you feel that you've been heard and maybe there was a majority that didn't agree with you, rather than if you've been shut down. So then let's talk about the content. So that was all the preamble. We're now getting into the nitty-gritty and the content of the conversation. The goals. We touched on that earlier, of the overall goals of the discussion as a whole, but talk about what you're going to talk about that day. Are you coming up with general guidelines for the family, or are you coming up with a specific decision because great Aunt Edna wants to come tomorrow at noon, and is that something that you think is suitable or not? So are you going for the big picture? Are you going for very specifics? If you can really find down what you're heading towards, it will be easier to have the conversation, and you won't get lost down too many rabbit holes if you know what you're trying to head towards. Make room for differing opinions. I'm not sure that this picture is too obvious, but it was that blue or yellow dress that came up a few years ago, and people seem to split into two groups of what they saw. It's back to these inexplicable differing opinions. It's back to that slide where we were talking about all these different aspects of people that make for the difference of opinions. But make room for them. Don't shut them down. Shutting down opinions doesn't work. Sometimes it feels good in the moment. It's just like, well, I'm going to be the decider, and you're going to just have to lump it. But in the end, you're going to get pushback. You're going to get much more of a problematic next step if you've got people feeling that they haven't even been listened to or understood. You don't need to agree on everything. What you're trying to agree on is a plan. And it can be a plan that you'll revisit. It can be a plan that you'll then talk about in the next meeting or the next conversation. So it's a smaller goal that you're heading towards, not an overall agreement on everything, but a plan that you can work with for the next day or week, or even few weeks. Examine your triggers. That's for yourself and for the other people. Examine your inconsistencies. It's amazing how many stories I hear of somebody who's on 100% lockdown, but then they're very happy to have a pizza delivery. Or people who are very kind of calm about many things, but there's one trigger that really connects for them. These are going to be connected with your past experiences, and these are things that you really need to work out, not only your own, but also others. Try and be as open and as honest about the discussion as possible. Understand your meanings and the values that you lay onto things, and the same with others. Safety is a hot topic for everyone. It comes down to a real core for family decisions and household decisions, and decisions going back to work. I think safety is probably the thing that makes us most concerned, most worried, and therefore most reactive in a conversation. So take a moment to underscore what's going well. Even if you can't agree on some of the bigger issues, are there some of the smaller ones you've agreed on? Remember that neural pathway that we're trying to both make and reinforce. If you can really underscore what's going well, you can do that piece of it better next time. So what happens when you get to an impasse? You get to an impasse, you just can't make any headway. Don't panic, and also don't start dictating. Finish the conversation with asking each participant to identify one of three things. They need to come up with one non-negotiable. They need to come up with one request that they will make from others to help them. And they need to come up with one offer of what they can do to help the others in the household. Take the temperature of the group and work out whether this is something that you want to try and get everybody to do before you break up, or whether that's something that everyone can go away and think about and bring to the next time you're talking. So use this as the basis for the next conversation. Don't then try and push through in this conversation. Either have everyone write it down, or have them go away and come back with it, and that will be the basis of when you start again. Again, it's easier to compromise if we feel heard. So get everybody to have those items, and even if people find it hard to come up with them, help them brainstorm it so that they are coming up with something that is their bottom line of what their ask and their offer is. A lot of the conversations I've had or questions I've been asked have been dealing with specifically with adolescents and young adults. So I wanted just to do one slide specifically on this. Remember that their executive functioning place is in a very different place than yours. So much of the disagreement is around the fact that they're maybe not fully developed in the way that they're thinking about things. So you got to expect, acknowledge, and respect their pushback. They are in that stage of life. That is what they are going to be doing. That doesn't mean you have to acquiesce to it. I think we want to stop ourselves being angry at the fact that there is pushback, and instead just say that's something that I expect for their age group. And what you've got is an opportunity to discuss some of the things that are really important for you in your family or your household. So discuss the values that we mentioned earlier, and discuss the priorities that you come up with. As much as possible, if you're a two-parent household, as much as possible, come to an agreement with as parents, and then present that as a united front to your children, to your adolescents and young adults in your family. But take it as an opportunity. It's something that you could really take an advantage of that moment. Use such language as "we are a family that." It's something that is all encompassing. It's not "I need you to do this." It's "we are a family that respects others, and so we feel it's important that we must wear a mask when we go out." Something like that. Be consistent with your message and with the consequences. And don't forget that you communicate as much through your actions as your words, whether you follow up on what you said you're going to follow up on. Pro tip, as a parent, try and admit as many areas as uncertainty or lack of information that you can. They know you're not omniscient, so there's really very little point in holding on to that fallacy. And I think you'll get a lot more respect if you can admit the areas of uncertainty and where you're just finding your way. And just remember the developmental stage that teenagers and adolescents, young adults are at. And remember the adult that you're hoping to raise. So you don't really want to shut them down. You want them to be able to argue their point. You want them to be able to be open about this. But you still will have a hierarchy within a family and be able to say this is the way that you want it to be. And you will have to do the follow through, which unfortunately is often a lot of hard work. But I think the more you can talk about the values and priorities, the more you're likely to get buy-in. So understanding and reviewing what may be our potential pitfalls, by doing that, we make ourselves more able to deal with them successfully when they come. So what are they? Well, we talked about the fundamental differences. I think another aspect is the echo chamber that we live in. If we've been in a pod, if we've been in lockdown, we're very often listening to our own opinions and less from the outside world. We all have different levels for our tolerance of risk. And so that's something we have to bear in mind in every conversation that we're having. This is a period of great anxiety. I think a lot of people have talked about how their stress levels are really up. When we have these conversations, we're likely to get into a state where we're flooded. And we've talked about that before. When you get flooded, you are less likely to be able to access the rational part of your brain. You're less likely to stay calm, and you're going to end up in that reactive low road that we've talked about, where you are only accessing your more crude primary emotions and not your more sophisticated secondary emotions. That then leads us into habitual disagreements. We kind of dig our heels in and we just don't move on things, and you get into that cycle of interaction of disagreement that you kind of had with your partner or within the household, which doesn't really get us very far. That then develops into the bitter bank, which is when you really haven't addressed some of these issues, and maybe you just suck it up in the moment and say, all right, I'm just going to move on. But you're kind of throwing that coin over your shoulder, and in the end you've got this pile of resentments or pile of disagreements that you really haven't dealt with. So again, my recommendation is you really air these things. And finally, change is hard. Change is hard. It is for everyone. Some people do it better than others, but I don't think any of us find it really that easy. So where are our positive counterpoints? What do we have at hand to manage and counterbalance those pitfalls? There's the managing anxiety with our self-care piece. That's all those things we know: good sleep, exercise, good food. And the more you can do that, the more you make yourself ready and able for these good conversations. Emphasize the collaboration piece. It's a team effort. Anxiety is a very lonely feeling. And so making an effort to connect and make a decision jointly is something that becomes less hard for us. Remember, we want to be on the thinking high road. That's being in control of our emotions in these conversations. And if we feel that we can do that and keep doing it, we will then be reinforcing our neural pathways. And the more we have successful conversations, the easier it is to have more successful ones down the road. Aim for a reasonable compromise. Try not to aim for the black and white. Try not to aim for a kind of win all on one side and a lose all on the other. Try and have something where there's a little bit of movement. Listen as much as possible and ask others to listen to you. And I think that this really is something that goes both ways, but cannot be emphasized enough. It's really important. This provides for a deeper connection. These conversations are hard, but they can truly deepen your connection and understanding of each other. And getting through hard times together really creates an extraordinary bond. So this is an opportunity, if you'd like to look through that silver lining, it's an opportunity for profound understanding. By digging deep into our values and beliefs and priorities, we can really increase our understanding of each other in important ways. But ultimately, yes, we know change is hard, but it is possible. Think back to transitions that you've navigated well in the past and remember and reinforce what works. Our brains respond very favorably to this, and it makes everything easier the next time round. Stop and congratulate yourself on your successes, even the small ones. Small successes beget more small successes, and they lead to greater ones, and eventually to managing these conversations, decisions, and the changes that you need to make. So what's our takeaway in trying to address these challenging conversations and decisions? One is really plan and manage your conversations. Put in a lot of that early time. Discuss the assumptions, the goals, the meanings, and the triggers. Again, this is the early practice and discussion that you're going to put in, the talking about the talking. Disagreements, re-safety are fraught, so remember to be as compassionate as you can be. We're going to underscore the joint goals and the common grounds. That's using the yellow highlighter, really trying to emphasize things that have gone well or that you're doing well. And remember, this is more than one conversation. It's not you're going to have this conversation and then it's all over. It's something that you'll want to go back to over and again, and you layering one onto another until you have really got to a place where you understand each other very well and can talk out some of the disagreements more easily. And finally, every day is a new day, and it's a new opportunity to do things differently and better. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining. Keep well and stay safe.